When the ocean burned at Pearl Harbor, America's hope sank with its ships. The Pacific was lost, the empire of Japan unstoppable. But in the silence that followed the explosions, one man stood among the wreckage, calm, quiet, and certain that the tide could still be turned. His name was Chester William Nimitz, and he was about to change the course of history. The morning after Pearl Harbor looked like the end of the world. Battleships lay on their sides like fallen giants, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burning oil. The Pacific Fleet, once America's pride, was now a graveyard of twisted metal. Soldiers walked in silence, faces blackened by ash, eyes empty. The unthinkable had happened. The United States Navy, the greatest maritime power on earth, had been humiliated in its own harbor. But while the nation mourned and politicians shouted for revenge, a man few had ever heard of quietly packed his bags in Washington. His name was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, a man known not for his anger, but for his calm. When President Roosevelt summoned him and offered command of the shattered Pacific Fleet, Nimitz didn't hesitate. He simply said, "Yes, sir." Then he left for Hawaii to rebuild what remained of the American dream. He arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941. The harbor still burned. The water shimmered black with fuel. Across the wrecks, sailors worked in silence, pulling out bodies from ships that were once symbols of invincibility. Nimitz stepped onto the pier, his uniform spotless, his expression steady. He didn't give a speech. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked around at the chaos, the destruction, the despair, and said softly, "The Japanese have awakened a sleeping giant. Let's make sure he never sleeps again." Unlike many admirals, Nimitz was not a man of ego. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't panic. He understood something fundamental. Wars are not won by emotion, but by reason. Where others saw disaster, he saw opportunity. The Japanese had destroyed the old Navy, the battleships, the pride of the past. But they had left something more important untouched: the aircraft carriers. It was there, in the quiet of that smoking harbor, that Nimitz made his first great decision to rebuild the Pacific Fleet around the carrier, not the battleship. It was a revolutionary idea. For decades, battleships had been the symbol of naval power, massive, armored, and unstoppable. But Nimitz knew the future belonged to the sky. The next war would not be won by guns, but by wings. He began by studying every detail of the enemy. Japan's empire stretched like a vast net across the Pacific, from Singapore to the Solomon Islands. They had speed, numbers, and confidence. But they also had arrogance. Nimitz understood the Japanese mentality better than most. He knew that beneath their discipline was a fatal flaw: overconfidence. "They think they've won already," he told one of his officers. "That's their first mistake." For weeks, Nimitz stayed in the field, walking among his men, visiting wrecked ships, and speaking with survivors. He asked questions, listened, and learned. He never shouted. He never threatened. His calmness became a kind of leadership no explosion could shake. Sailors began to believe again. If Nimitz was calm, then maybe they still had a chance. He reorganized the fleet with surgical precision. Every resource, every ship, every plane was accounted for. He turned what was left of the Navy into a machine built for efficiency, not pride. And behind his composure, a quiet fire began to grow. The determination to strike back. But Nimitz knew something the politicians in Washington did not. Rushing into battle would be suicide. America needed time to rebuild, to learn, to understand its enemy. So instead of charging forward, he waited. He studied the sea, the weather, the codes, the psychology of the Japanese command. He transformed patience into strategy. "Never fight when you are angry," he wrote in his notes. "Fight when you are ready." As the weeks turned into months, his plan began to form. He read the ocean like a chessboard. Every island, every ship, every route was a potential move. He knew that victory would not come from brute force, but from deception, timing, and faith in intelligence. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was already planning the next great strike. He believed the Americans were broken, that they would crumble before Japan's might. But what he didn't know was that Nimitz was already watching him, quietly, through a web of intelligence and codebreakers, who were beginning to unravel the secrets of the Japanese Navy. Nimitz understood that every empire has a rhythm, moments of attack and moments of vulnerability. He waited for that moment, building his fleet, training his pilots, strengthening his communications, turning chaos into coordination. By early 1942, something had changed in the Pacific. The fear was still there, but it had a new name: resolve. Nimitz had taken command of not just ships, but of belief itself. And belief, he knew, was the strongest weapon in any war. He wrote a letter to his wife back home. "It is a great task before us, but I believe we will do it. The enemy may hold the advantage for now, but they do not understand what it means to fight for freedom. That will be our victory." In those months of silence, when the Pacific seemed lost, Nimitz was shaping the future. He wasn't waiting for the storm to pass. He was learning how to command it. The calm man from Texas, born far from any ocean, was now the only one standing between Japan's empire and America's survival. And soon, the sleeping giant he commanded would awaken. In early 1942, the Pacific was not an ocean. It was a vast empire of conquest. Japan had spread its power like wildfire across Asia and the Pacific, from the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Solomon Islands. The rising sun seemed eternal. Its ships ruled the waves, its soldiers captured everything in their path, and its people believed destiny itself was on their side. The United States, still bleeding from Pearl Harbor, had been pushed back to the edges of the world. But far from Tokyo, in a dark office overlooking the ruins of Pearl Harbor, Chester W. Nimitz stared at a map covered in red ink. Where others saw chaos, he saw a pattern. Where others saw the Pacific as endless and uncontrollable, he saw a chessboard, and every island, every route, every fleet was a move waiting to be played. Nimitz knew that the Japanese advantage was built on illusion. They were fast, aggressive, and proud, but they were also stretched thin, spread across thousands of miles of ocean, each victory pulling them farther from their own shores. He understood that they could not be everywhere at once. All he needed was to strike at the right place, at the right time. But to do that, he needed eyes in the dark information, the kind of knowledge that came not from ships, but from silence. So, while generals demanded action and politicians screamed for revenge, Nimitz did something far more dangerous. He waited. He turned the remains of his fleet into something new. Gone were the days of battleships, those floating monuments of iron and pride. They were too slow, too predictable. The future was in the air. The aircraft carrier would become the new capital of war. From them, he could strike from hundreds of miles away, unseen, unstoppable. But carriers were fragile. They needed coordination, protection, intelligence. Every move had to be precise, because one mistake could mean total destruction. In an old warehouse on Oahu, a small group of men worked in secret, listening to the whispers of the enemy. They were Kryptonless, code breakers, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. In a room full of cigarette smoke, coffee cups, and typewriters, they read fragments of Japanese radio transmissions. Words, numbers, coordinates, useless to most, priceless to Nimitz. From these fragments, a picture began to form. Somewhere in those endless messages, Japan was planning its next strike. Day after day, Nimitz studied the reports. The Japanese were speaking in riddles, referring to a mysterious target called AF. No one knew what it meant, but if he could uncover it, he could see the enemy's next move before it happened. And that was the key to winning a war. Nimitz trusted Rochefort completely. Others doubted him, mocked the idea that victory could come from mathematics and machines. But Nimitz believed in science as much as he believed in courage. He once said, "The battle is won long before the first shot is fired, by those who can see what others cannot." And soon they saw. The codebreakers discovered a way to test their theory. On Nimitz's orders, they sent a fake message from the base at Midway Island, claiming its water supply had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese intelligence radioed that AF was short on water. The deception worked. AF was Midway. The trap was revealed. Now, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Nimitz had an advantage. He knew where Japan would strike. He knew when, and he knew that the empire that had seemed invincible was walking straight into his hands. He began to move his pieces. In secret, the American fleet set sail, heading north of Midway, every movement disguised by silence and deception. Nimitz planned the operation like a game of chess played on an ocean the size of the moon. His aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were positioned like hunters in the dark, waiting for the enemy to arrive. The Japanese believed they were the predators. They thought the Americans would come running to defend Midway. They didn't know that Nimitz had already set the board, already predicted their exact path. The empire that had humiliated the United States 6 months earlier was now sailing straight toward its own destruction. As the fleets moved closer, Nimitz remained at his headquarters, calm and unshaken. His officers described him as a man who never seemed tired, never seemed afraid. He would stand before the map of the Pacific for hours, tracing his finger over islands and coordinates, calculating distances, imagining where each ship might be at that very moment. Every commander must learn to think in 3 dimensions, he told them: space, time, and deception. He was not gambling, he was solving. For days, the ocean swallowed both fleets in silence. No one knew exactly when or where they would meet. The Japanese fleet under Admiral Yamamoto, the same man who had ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor, was massive. For carriers, 2 battleships, heavy cruisers, and hundreds of planes, they believed they were untouchable. They had no idea that death was waiting above the clouds. By early June, reports began to pour in. Scout planes sighted distant ships. Radio chatter crackled with tension. The enemy was near, and still, Nimitz said almost nothing. He stood quietly beside his map, surrounded by men who waited for his orders, and whispered, "We will meet them at Midway." It was a sentence of destiny. What followed would not be a battle of brute strength, but of precision. It would not be decided by who fired first, but by who understood the rhythm of war itself. Nimitz had learned that wars are not fought on the battlefield. They are fought in the mind, in the moments before the first bullet flies. And as his fleet closed in on Midway, he knew that everything, every death, every mistake, every lesson since Pearl Harbor had led to this point. The sleeping giant had awakened, and his first act would be vengeance. The morning of June 4th, 1942, began with the kind of stillness that only comes before disaster. The Pacific stretched in every direction, endless, beautiful, and cruelly calm. Beneath that sky, 2 fleets moved toward each other across thousands of miles of ocean. One believed it was unstoppable. The other was waiting to prove it wrong. Chester W. Nimitz had played his hand in silence, and now the pieces were in motion. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, history was about to turn. The Japanese came as expected, 4 of their best carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each carried planes, bombs, and the arrogance of a fleet that had never been defeated. Their commander, Admiral Nagumo, believed this battle would crush the Americans for good. He didn't know that Nimitz had already read his plans like an open book. Hidden far to the northeast, the American carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet waited in silence, engines idling, pilots tense. The trap was set. At dawn, the first Japanese bombers attacked Midway Island, turning the small airbase into a storm of fire and debris. American gunners fought back with everything they had, but the sky was filled with smoke and screaming engines. On the surface, it looked like another Japanese victory, precise, overwhelming, inevitable. Nagumo, watching from the bridge of Akagi, ordered a second wave to finish the job. It was a decision that would destroy him. As his crews refueled and rearmed planes on their decks, hundreds of bombs and torpedoes lay scattered in the open. Below deck, fuel lines ran like veins across the ships. One spark, one mistake, and the entire fleet would go up in flame. But Nagumo was confident, too confident. He had no idea that death was already in the air, flying toward him from beyond the horizon. On the American side, Admiral Raymond Spruance, acting under Nimitz's orders, made the riskiest decision of the war. Without confirmation of the enemy's exact position, he ordered every available aircraft to launch. The pilots didn't know if they'd find anything. Many never did. They flew low over an endless ocean, running out of fuel, searching for an enemy that seemed to have vanished. Some squadrons were lost entirely, swallowed by the Pacific, but fate, it seemed, had chosen a few. Shortly before 10 a.m., a group of dive bombers from the Enterprise broke through a gap in the clouds, and there below them was the heart of the Japanese Navy, for massive carriers, their decks packed with planes, fuel, and explosives. It was a perfect moment of vulnerability, one that would never come again. The bombers dove. The first hit Kaga. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. Then Akagi, then Soryu. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning, their decks torn open, their crews screaming in chaos. Pilots who had once flown proudly for the Emperor now leaped into the sea, uniforms on fire. The explosions echoed for miles. The ocean itself seemed to burn. On board the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in disbelief. He had been the Predator for so long that he didn't understand what was happening. His command ship was engulfed in flame. His Empire's pride, the weapon that had crushed Pearl Harbor, was dying in front of him. He gave the order to abandon ship. The rising sun flag fell into the sea. By noon, the battle was decided. Only one Japanese carrier remained. Hiryu she struck back fiercely, launching 2 counterattacks that crippled the Yorktown. The carrier's deck was torn apart, black smoke curling into the sky. Sailors fought the fires until they could no longer stand. Yet even as Yorktown sank, she had served her purpose. American bombers from the Enterprise found Hiryu and sent her to the bottom of the Pacific. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed in a single day. The Empire's sword was broken. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz received the news quietly. His officers shouted, laughed, some even cried. But he didn't move. He simply stared at the map, his finger resting on Midway, and said softly, "This changes everything." The Battle of Midway was not just a victory. It was a resurrection. It restored faith to a nation that had been broken. It transformed the U.S. Navy from a wounded force into a predator. And it showed the world that Japan, once feared as invincible, could bleed. For Nimitz, it was the vindication of every decision he had made. His trust in intelligence, his belief in the carriers, his patience, all of it had come together in a single, perfect strike. Yet he felt no triumph. When a reporter later asked him how he felt after Midway, he simply said, "It was a good day for our side." Behind those words was something deeper, the understanding that war is never truly won. Every victory comes with a shadow. Hundreds of American pilots had not returned. Many vanished without a trace, their planes still drifting beneath the waves. Midway was a turning point, but it was also a graveyard. In Tokyo, the news was met with disbelief. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, received the report in silence. His prediction had come true. 6 months earlier, he had warned his government, "If we go to war with America, we can run wild for 6 months. After that, I can guarantee nothing." It had been exactly 6 months. From that day forward, the Japanese Empire began to retreat, slowly, painfully, inevitably. The Pacific, once their ocean, was now turning against them. And Chester Nimitz, the man who had rebuilt hope from ashes, was now leading the greatest counteroffensive in naval history. But even as he planned the next move, he refused to underestimate his enemy. "They will not stop until the last man falls," he wrote. "We must be ready for every inch." The war was far from over. Midway had turned the tide, but the tide still had to reach the shore. As the smoke cleared over the ocean, the wrecks of Japan's carriers burned until they sank beneath the waves. The sea returned to silence, hiding the evidence of what had happened. To the world, Midway became a symbol of courage, of intelligence, of fate. But for Nimitz, it was a lesson. He knew that victory at sea was fleeting. The ocean gives, and the ocean takes. And somewhere beyond that endless horizon, he could already see the next battles coming. Guadalcanal, Tarawa Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The road ahead would be long, brutal, and unforgiving. But for the first time since the war began, America was no longer fighting to survive. It was fighting to win. Victory at Midway had changed everything. The Japanese Navy, once untouchable, was now bleeding. But Nimitz knew the truth. Winning a single battle was not the same as winning a war. The Pacific stretched wider than any imagination could grasp, and every island on it was now a fortress. Japan had dug in, transforming each speck of land into a trap of guns, tunnels, and death. If the United States wanted to end the war, it would have to fight its way across an ocean, one island at a time. It was Nimitz who gave the order for a new kind of strategy, island hopping. Instead of facing the enemy head-on everywhere, the fleet would leap across the Pacific like a ghost, seizing only what mattered and bypassing the rest. Every island had a purpose, some for airfields, others for ports, some simply to bring America closer to Japan. It wasn't about pride, it was about precision. Every mile gained would bring the empire closer to its breaking point. The first step came at Guadalcanal in August 1942. The island was small, humid, and nearly forgotten, but its airfield was vital. When U.S. Marines landed there, they expected resistance. What they found was hell. Japanese forces struck back with ferocity the Americans had never seen. The jungle swallowed men whole. The nights were alive with screams, the sound of insects, and the whisper of death. At sea, Nimitz's fleet fought desperate battles to protect the island. Ships burned under moonlight, pilots vanished into the black waves. Guadalcanal became a nightmare, not just for the soldiers who fought there, but for every commander who read the casualty reports. Still, Nimitz refused to pull back. "We will hold," he said. "No matter what, we will hold." And after 6 months of slaughter, the Japanese retreated. Guadalcanal was secure. It was a small victory on a small island, but it carried the weight of history. For the first time, the rising sun had set. From that moment on, Nimitz began to move like a chess player again. He studied maps for hours, memorizing coastlines, reefs, and currents. His commanders often said he could read the Pacific like other men read books. Every island, every reef, every storm had meaning. The next target was Tarawa, a coral atoll no bigger than a city park, but it was fortified like a fortress. When the Marines landed in November 1943, the tides betrayed them. The landing craft got stuck on reefs, forcing men to wade hundreds of meters under machine gun fire. The sea turned red. 76 hours later, the island was captured, but the price was staggering. 1 in every 5 Marines who stepped ashore never came back. When Nimitz received the casualty list, he said nothing. He simply nodded and whispered, "We'll learn." And they did. From Tarawa's blood, the Navy perfected the art of amphibious warfare. New landing craft, new tactics, better coordination. The fleet was evolving with every island. Nimitz turned pain into progress. By 1944, the United States had become an unstoppable force. New carriers, new ships, and new aircraft flooded the Pacific. The Navy that had once been crippled at Pearl Harbor was now the most powerful armada the world had ever seen. But Japan was not surrendering. Every battle was fiercer than the last. The closer Nimitz came to Japan, the more desperate his enemy became. At Saipan, in the Mariana Islands, the Americans struck at the heart of Japan's defense. The battle lasted 3 weeks. Entire cliffs were soaked in blood. When defeat became inevitable, thousands of Japanese civilians, men, women, even children, threw themselves from the cliffs rather than surrender. American soldiers watched in silence, horrified, unable to stop it. When Nimitz read the reports, he placed his pen down and said quietly, "This is no victory. This is tragedy." But there was no turning back. From Saipan, American bombers could now reach Tokyo. The Japanese homeland was within range, and the empire knew it. Still, they refused to yield. Every defeat only fueled their determination to die fighting. On the seas, kamikazes, suicide pilots appeared for the first time. They crashed their planes directly into American ships, turning themselves into human missiles. There was no defense. The ocean burned night and day. Thousands of sailors died in waves of fire. Nimitz understood that this was not just a military war anymore. It was psychological, a battle for will. The Japanese were ready to sacrifice everything. "We are fighting an enemy who worships death," he told his staff, "so we must value life even more." As the fleet advanced, Nimitz continued his island hop in Guam. Peleliu, Leyte, Iwo Jima. Each name became synonymous with horror. Each victory brought America closer to Japan. Each mile forward cost more lives than the last. On Iwo Jima, 26,000 Americans were killed or wounded. The photograph of the flag raised on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of triumph, but Nimitz saw it differently. Among the Americans who fought on this island, he said, uncommon valor was a common virtue. The line was brief, simple, and eternal. It captured the soul of his command: courage without arrogance, sacrifice without noise. By 1945, Nimitz had become something larger than a man. To his sailors, he was a legend. To his enemies, a phantom. He commanded not from the front, but from everywhere, his mind reaching across thousands of miles of ocean. The fleet was an extension of his will. His patience, his silence, his precision had reshaped the Pacific into a weapon. But even as victory drew near, he carried the weight of what it had cost. The islands they conquered were no longer places, they were cemeteries, each one covered with the ghosts of those who had fought there. Nimitz often walked the decks of his flagship at night, alone, staring out over the dark sea. "We are winning," he told one officer. "But the ocean is winning too." He had brought America to the edge of Japan. The empire that had once dreamed of eternal glory was now surrounded, starving and broken. But the closer Nimitz came to ending the war, the more he began to question what ending truly meant. Because in the fire and the silence of the Pacific, he had learned that victory and loss often looked the same. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific was no longer an ocean. It was a graveyard. Japan was surrounded, isolated, yet unbroken. Its empire was dying, but its will to fight burned brighter than ever. Entire cities had been reduced to ashes by American bombers, yet the Japanese government refused to surrender. The emperor still spoke of victory. The people still trained with bamboo spears. And in the middle of it all, Chester W. Nimitz stood aboard his flagship, watching the sea that had carried him through 3 years of hell, knowing that the end was near, but not knowing what kind of end it would be. Okinawa was the final step before Japan. A small green island, just 70 miles long, but it would become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. When American troops landed in April 1945, they met an enemy that did not defend the beaches. The Japanese waited inland, buried in tunnels, hidden in caves, turning the island itself into a weapon. What followed was not a battle, but a storm. Rain fell for weeks. The ground turned to mud, and the air to smoke. Every hill, every valley, every inch of the island was bought with blood. At sea, the sky was filled with suicide planes. Kamikazes, the divine wind, fell from the clouds like fire from heaven. They struck ships, hospitals, carriers, anything that floated. Sailors who survived described the sound, the scream of vengeance, the impact, the explosion, the silence after. The fleet lost 36 ships. Thousands of men were burned alive. In those weeks, the Pacific became an inferno. When it was finally over, Okinawa had been erased from the map. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. 12,000 Americans had joined them. The beaches were littered with bodies. Civilians had jumped from cliffs to their deaths, believing surrender was dishonor. The sea was red for days. Nimitz read the reports in silence. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, almost to himself, "How many more?" He knew that the next step would be the invasion of Japan itself, Operation Downfall. The plan called for 2 million men, 10,000 ships, and an ocean of blood. His analysts predicted nearly 1 million American casualties. And Nimitz, who had seen enough death for several lifetimes, began to wonder if victory could ever justify what it demanded. He tried to reason with Washington. "We can take their land," he said, "but not their spirit." Japan would fight to the last man, woman, and child. He had learned to understand his enemy, and he knew their pride would never allow surrender. But while Nimitz wrestled with his conscience, a new weapon was about to change everything. Rumors had reached him of a project so secret that even admirals were not told its name. Scientists in the deserts of New Mexico had built something unlike anything the world had ever seen. A single bomb that could destroy an entire city. The Manhattan Project. Nimitz didn't like what he heard. He was a man of war, but not of annihilation. He had seen the ocean swallow fleets and burn men alive, and he understood the weight of destruction. If we win by killing everything, he said privately, what have we learned? But the decision was no longer his. On August 6, 1945, a single American bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In seconds, the city vanished. 80,000 people died instantly. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The world went silent. When the message reached Nimitz aboard his flagship, his crew expected cheers, celebration, victory. But there was none. He stared at the horizon for a long time and said only 4 words: God help us all. Days later, Emperor Hirohito broke centuries of silence and addressed his nation for the first time. We must endure the unendurable, he said. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. On September 2, 1945, Chester Nimitz stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Around him, American sailors lined the rails of their ships. Above, the sky was clear and quiet. Before him stood the representatives of Japan, pale, defeated, their eyes fixed on the floor. General Douglas MacArthur read the terms of surrender. Pens scratched against paper. Cameras clicked. And with a few signatures, the deadliest war in human history came to an end. Nimitz signed his name for the United States of America. Then he stepped back and looked toward the Japanese mountains beyond the harbor. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his fist. He simply watched in silence, knowing that while the war had ended, its ghosts would never leave. The sea forgives no one, he murmured to his aide. Not them, not us. When the ceremony ended, sailors cheered. Bands played. The American flag rose above Tokyo Bay, but Nimitz stayed still. In his pocket was a note he had written that morning. It said, "This victory belongs to them, to those who never returned." As his fleet prepared to sail home, the Pacific was calm again. No gunfire, no smoke, no cries. Just waves and wind, as if the ocean had decided to rest. Yet for Nimitz, the silence felt heavier than the war itself. He had seen too much. He had commanded death, and now, even in victory, he carried its weight. He walked the deck alone that night, watching the moon's reflection ripple across the sea. The water glowed softly, peaceful, eternal. But he knew what lay beneath it: the wrecks of ships, the bones of sailors, the memory of fire. The ocean that had been his greatest ally had also been his greatest witness. He thought of all the battles: Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each one carved into his mind like scars. Each one a lesson in courage and in loss. We fought to end all wars, he said quietly. Let's hope we didn't just invent the next one. He was right to wonder. The atomic bomb had ended one war, but it had begun another. One fought not with armies, but with fear. Nimitz could feel it. The world had entered a new age, one where peace itself was fragile, balanced on the edge of a weapon more powerful than any fleet. And as the USS Missouri turned toward home, the Admiral who had conquered the Pacific stood at the rail, hat in hand, and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for mercy. The ocean was calm, the world was quiet, and for the first time in years, Chester W. Nimitz closed his eyes and listened to the silence he had earned. When Chester W. Nimitz returned to the United States, he was greeted as a hero. The war was over, and the man who had commanded the greatest fleet in human history was now the symbol of victory itself. Across America, crowds filled the streets, waving flags and cheering his name. Newspapers called him the Pacific Victor, the calm commander, the man who ended the empire. But behind his quiet smile, Nimitz felt something different. Not triumph, but a strange, heavy silence. After years of war, he no longer knew what peace was supposed to sound like. He went home to Fredericksburg, Texas, the small town where he had been born, hundreds of miles from the sea. The same fields, the same wind, the same people. But he had changed. The boy who once dreamed of ships and oceans had become a man who had seen what those dreams could cost. Reporters followed him everywhere, asking how it felt to win the war. He always gave the same answer: I didn't win it. The men did. He refused parades, turned down interviews, and declined most honors. The world saw a legend. He saw ghosts. At night, he would sit on the porch, listening to the crickets and the faraway hum of the world he had fought to save. Sometimes he closed his eyes and saw the ocean, not blue and peaceful, but gray, endless, and full of fire. The sound of waves always brought back the screams of the dying. The smell of rain reminded him of burning oil. The silence of peace was, in truth, just the echo of war. When he spoke at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, the young cadets hung on his every word. They expected stories of glory, tales of battle, heroism, and victory, but Nimitz spoke softly. "The sea," he said, "is a friend to no man. It gives and it takes. Respect it and never forget those it has taken from us." He paused, then added, "War teaches many lessons, but none that make life easier." He had become Commander-in-Chief of the entire U.S. Navy. His office in Washington was vast, decorated with medals, portraits, and maps, symbols of power. Yet he spent little time there. He preferred to walk the docks, speak with sailors, and look at ships. He always asked their names, always remembered their faces. "They remind me," he told one aide, "why we fight and why we should never want to again." The nation celebrated him. Hollywood made films about the war. Children learned his name in school. But fame was something he could never get used to. "People call me a hero," he once said, "but I have buried too many of them to believe it." He wrote few letters, gave few speeches. The only thing he truly wanted was to make sure it never happened again. He warned of a new kind of war, one fought not with ships or planes, but with fear and fire. "The next war," he said in a quiet interview, "will not be fought at sea. It will be fought in the hearts of men." He knew that the atomic bomb had changed everything. Power had become too easy, destruction too fast. He believed that the real victory would not come from military strength, but from restraint. In 1947, when he was promoted to Fleet Admiral, the highest possible rank, he accepted it without celebration. His wife Catherine said he hung the certificate on the wall and never looked at it again. He still drove his own car, still cooked his own meals, still spoke to sailors as if he were one of them. That humility, that calmness, was what defined him. The same calm that had rebuilt a navy and turned the tide of a world war. Yet, as the years passed, the memories grew heavier. The Pacific never left him. He visited Pearl Harbor one last time. The harbor was quiet now. The wreck of the Arizona lay beneath the water, still bleeding oil after all these years. Tourists walked above it, whispering, taking pictures. Nimitz stood at the edge of the memorial, hands behind his back, head bowed. A reporter asked what he was thinking. He answered, "They never left. They're still standing watch." Then he turned and walked away. At home, he surrounded himself with books, history, philosophy, theology. He read the Bible often, underlining passages about mercy and forgiveness. One night, he told a friend, "I have no enemies left, only memories." He wrote in his journal, "We won the war. But sometimes, I wonder what it costs us to win peace." In his later years, he became an advocate for reconciliation. He supported rebuilding Japan, encouraged peace treaties, and urged the Navy to treat its former enemies with dignity. "We fought them," he said, "but we also understood them. They loved their country as we love ours." Those words shocked many at the time, but they revealed the man beneath the uniform, a warrior who no longer believed in war. He was often asked about leadership, about how he stayed calm in chaos. His answer was always the same. When you're in command, your men take their tone from you. If you lose your head, they lose theirs. So stay calm, stay clear, and never forget that every order you give costs something, sometimes everything. It was that philosophy that had guided him through the fire. By the time the 1950s arrived, the world had changed again. A new war was brewing in Korea. The nuclear arms race had begun. The lessons of the Pacific were fading into history. But Nimitz stayed out of politics. He lived quietly in California, near the ocean he had both conquered and feared. He walked along the shore each morning, staring at the waves, hands clasped behind his back. Neighbors said he looked like a man still on duty, watching, waiting, guarding the peace he had earned. As the years faded, his health declined, but his mind stayed sharp. Visitors often found him at his desk, writing letters to the families of sailors lost at sea. He remembered every ship, every battle, every name. "We owed them more than remembrance," he once said. "We owed them a world that learns." When journalists came to record his final interviews, they asked if he had any regrets. He thought for a long moment, then smiled gently. "Only that I had to see so much to understand so little." Then he looked toward the window, where the ocean shimmered in the distance, and whispered, "The sea is eternal, men are not. But what we do upon it, that lasts." The years passed quietly. The man who had once commanded an ocean now lived by its edge, in a small house overlooking the Pacific, the same sea that had carried his name into history. Chester W. Nimitz had outlived the war, the headlines, the parades, and almost everyone who had fought beside him. The noise of battle was gone now, replaced by the soft rhythm of waves against the shore. To most of the world, he was an old hero fading into memory. But to those who knew him, he was something deeper, a man who had seen both the greatness and the madness of humankind, and somehow kept his soul intact. Each morning, he would rise early and walk the beach alone. His steps were slow, his back slightly bent, but his eyes still carried that same calm light that had guided fleets through fire and chaos. The ocean was always changing, yet somehow the same, endless, powerful, and indifferent. Nimitz often said the sea reminded him of life, beautiful, dangerous, and impossible to control. Sometimes he would stop, take off his hat, and stand in silence, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Perhaps he was listening to the past, to the echoes of the men who had sailed under his command, to the voices carried by the wind across time. He rarely spoke about the war anymore. When journalists came to visit, hoping for stories, he would smile politely and change the subject. "The war belongs to history now," he'd say. "Let it rest." But sometimes, in quiet moments, he would let a memory escape. Midway, he once said softly to a young officer, wasn't just a battle, it was a miracle. We were outnumbered, outgunned, outflown, but we had belief. And that, son, is worth more than any ship. He never glorified what he had done. He never called himself a hero. To him, heroism belonged to the men who didn't come home, the ones whose names were carved into the cold metal of memorial walls. "They are the real admirals," he said once. They command the silence now. As he aged, his body weakened, but his mind remained sharp. He read constantly, history, philosophy, poetry. His favorite book was Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. He often quoted a line, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." Those words, he said, were enough to live by. He was offered political office more than once, even urged to run for president. He refused every time. "I've commanded enough men," he would answer. "Let others lead now." He believed power should always be temporary, and that humility was the final test of greatness. Even in his final years, he still signed his letters the same way. Respectfully, C.W. Nimitz. Never admiral, never hero, just a man. In the early 1960s, he returned to Pearl Harbor one last time. The harbor was peaceful, the sun bright. Beneath the surface, the ghost of the USS Arizona still slept, a silent tomb of over 1,000 men. Nimitz stood there for a long time, his reflection rippling over the water. The tourists kept their distance. They knew they were in the presence of something sacred. He whispered something no one could hear, a prayer, maybe, or an apology, then saluted, turned, and walked away without another word. He spent his last years near the sea, surrounded by his family, visited by young sailors who came just to shake his hand. They called him the Admiral, even though he told them not to. To them, he was a living legend, the man who had guided them through textbooks, through history, through the impossible. He would listen to their stories, offer quiet advice, and end every meeting the same way. Take care of each other. That's the only order that ever matters. As his health declined, he became more introspective. Friends said he would sit by the window for hours, watching the waves, writing short notes in a small leather journal. One of them, found after his death, read, "The ocean does not remember battles, but it remembers the men." Another simply said, Peace is the hardest command. In early 1966, his condition worsened. He grew weaker, quieter, as if the weight of the past was finally ready to rest. On a calm evening in February, with the sound of the sea drifting through his window, Chester W. Nimitz passed away in his sleep. No alarms, no speeches, no final orders, just silence, the kind of silence he had earned. At his funeral, there were no grand displays. He had requested a simple service, with no eulogies and no parade. Only sailors stood around his coffin, their heads bowed. As they lowered him into the ground at Golden Gate National Cemetery, a bugle played taps. The notes hung in the air like waves breaking against stone. One officer whispered, "He's gone home to the sea." His tombstone was plain. No medals, no titles, just a name, a date, and a rank. The man who had commanded the Pacific wanted nothing more, but his legacy lived on. Every ship that sails, every sailor who wears the uniform, carries a piece of his quiet strength. His philosophy, patience, humility, precision became the doctrine of the modern Navy. And even today, his words are taught to new officers. Leadership is calm under fire. The sea does not respect noise. In the end, Chester W. Nimitz didn't conquer the Pacific. He understood it. He learned that mastery over chaos doesn't come from force, but from balance, the same balance he carried in his heart until the very end. And as the sun sets over the ocean he once ruled, the waves still whisper his story, not of war, not of power, but of a man who found peace in the same sea that once burned beneath his ships. The tide comes in, the tide goes out, and somewhere, beyond the horizon, the last Admiral sails on, calm as ever.